All right, as we begin tonight, I want to remember that in Romans chapter 1, the first 17 verses could be called the introduction. Verse 17 is the theme, the just shall live by faith. Now, as we start out in verse 18, from 18 through the rest of chapter 1, Paul is showing that the Gentiles are in sin. And he starts out by showing that everybody, whoever you are, has evidence around you that there is a God. Now, in a little while, tonight, in chapter 2, he's going to be talking about the Jews. And in the Jews, God has given them a law. He's given them a written law. But he never gave the Gentiles a written law. But what he's trying to show us here is that, kind of threw me. I think that's supposed to always down. All right, kind of a written law, but now the Gentiles don't have a written law. So, do they have any evidence that there is a God? Well, we went down through it and we saw it in verse 20, why it showed in there that through the things that are made, then we can see certain things that they may be without excuse. I think it's kind of neat that this past week, here it is, just a little article. We're not going to go into it at any length at all. But ABC News has come out and so forth and showing that here is a famous atheist in England who now believes that there is a God. And it's kind of interesting. The reason he believes there's a God, he says, as you look at the DNA, it is just too complicated. There's no way you could have that DNA system without there being a God. Now, this guy is 81 years old, and he now has come to the conclusion that there has to be a God. There has to be an intellectual force behind all of these things that we see that's here. Now, he goes ahead, and he says, of course, he still doesn't believe in life after death, and he says, you know, that he doesn't believe that God has a hand in things here. But let's stop to think for just a moment. As you start out now and you read in Romans 1, what is it that God says you can see by looking at the universe? Whether you're looking at the DNA, whether you're looking at all the billions and billions and trillions of stars that there is out there, what is it that you can honestly, intellectually see? And Romans 1 tells you what it is. Does it show you how good God is? Does it show you what you have to do to be a Christian? Does it tell you that God is involved in your life? It doesn't tell you any of that. What does it tell you? God exists. His eternity and His divinity. And you have to come to the conclusion that this guy has come to. And that is, there has to be an intellectual power behind this. It couldn't just happen. Now, as you look at His everlasting power and divinity, you have to look at how much power do you see that this God has, this intelligent creator. How much power can you see He has? Absolutely boggles the mind, doesn't it? We can't conceive of it. How much intellect does He have? How smart is He? Can't even start to conceive of it. Just this one little thing here. Now, what you have to do then is that you start at that point and you say, now, it's very evident that there is a God. Now, what is the next question that you would ask yourself when you come to the conclusion there is a God? Suppose you're in this man's shoes. What's the next question that he'll be thinking about as he goes to bed tonight? There is a God. He has to be eternal, and He has to be so powerful that He's created all of this. He has to be so brilliant and wise that He's able to put it all together. There is that kind of a God. What's the question you're going to have on your mind? What?
How do you do it? What should I do?
There it is. What should I do? What should I do? Now, can you look at the DNA and tell what you should do? No. No. Now then, it takes something else. See? It takes something else. I think that a rational person would start thinking, if there's a God and he's that powerful, he's that great, he's that brilliant, he's that smart, he's that understanding, maybe, just maybe, he has a purpose for us. Since he's created us, maybe there is a purpose out there. Maybe he is involved. And if you come to that conclusion, then what do you start doing? You start seeking, do you not? See? You start seeking. Now, here's a wonderful thing that we have, and we talked about this last week. Do you remember that word seek that we talked about last week? And the definition of it? Oliver knows because his little boy taught him. But it really made an impression on Oliver. And he came and told me. And it's a perfect illustration of little Carson. When you talk about seeking, I'll just ask you how many of you were asleep and how many of you can give me the definition that I gave you. Isn't that embarrassing? Can you give me that definition that I gave you? There we go. It's looking, striving, seeking with an aim to find it. In other words, I'm going to find it. It's not just with an aim of looking around. So I lost something. Well, where is it? Well, I'm seeking. Mitch, would you look under your chair there? Well, okay, let's go on with class. Was I seeking? Yeah, I was seeking, but that's not the meaning of that word. See, the meaning of that word is seeking with an aim to find. You're not going to stop until you find it. Now, what was it that Jesus said? Seek and what? Ye shall find. See, seek and ye shall find. You're wondering about Carson. Saturday night or something like this, why his birth mother called. And so she told Carson, said, we're going to church. And Carson said, are you going to the Church of Christ? And she said, well, no, we're going somewhere else. He said, you ought to be going to the Church of Christ. Well, we're going somewhere else. Well, you ought to be going to the Church of Christ. Well, we're going here. Well, Mom, you ought to be going. Well, I don't even know whether there is one. Well, that's where you ought to be going. And so Nancy took the phone and she's talking, and so Carson's talking to Oliver, and Oliver said, she lives down there not too far from Jack Hafer. Carson said, what's Jack's phone number? Dad, give Jack's phone number. Get his phone number. Oliver starts fumbling around. Dad, get me Jack's phone number. And Oliver, not working fast, said, get me Jack's phone number. And he made him go get the phone number before she got off the phone, got it, goes, takes the phone out of her hand. Hey, here's the guy you call. Here's his number. Well, the point was Oliver was talking about the difference between Carson and him, see, and how he had set up a Bible class the day before, but it was kind of oh-hum. Some people left a note, said they'd like to have a Bible class, so Oliver says, well, yeah, I guess I got time to call them. Maybe I'll call, and a little dilatory, and then all of a sudden he sees Carson, and Sunday morning Oliver came in with the most guilty conscience you've ever seen in your life. And he said, here's what that word means, seek. Well, it really is. See, it really is. And so this is what Jesus is saying. Seek. See, seek. And you will find, and you're going to be without excuse. Now, that's what we find in chapter 1 about that. Now, in chapter 2, it's not about the Gentiles, but chapter 2 now is going to be about the Jews. So he's going to turn with the Jews, and he's going to show the Jews, you also are in sin. Now, we've talked about this, and I know that I'm repeating myself, but Paul spends almost 3 chapters, 2 full chapters, on this very point, trying to show people you are in sin. Now, I want you to stop to think, how important is it for you to be convinced that you have a need if you're going to pay a big price for it? Now, some of the kids may come in here someday and have some candy bars, and you go out, you don't have a need for them. I've seen guys, they'll buy a candy bar off of a kid, and as I walk by, they give it to me. See? Well, it cost them, $2.50 or whatever it is. But how many of you would make a donation to the kid out there for $25,000, or buy that candy bar or buy something else if you weren't really convinced you had a need? Now, that's very important for us human beings to realize that, because we go through life and there's a lot of things we don't realize about ourselves. And that's one of them, that we just don't realize our need. If we really realized our need, man, what could stop you from finding the truth and searching for the truth? See? What could stop you? If you go to the doctor tomorrow and the doctor tells you you have cancer and there's nothing he can do about it, what are you going to do? And you're going to go home, you're going to start looking, and somebody, well, why don't you just wait a while and see what happens? What would you say? No, I have a problem. I only have so long to live. I have a need, and I'm going to get on it. Now, all of us are going to meet this great God before very long. See, here's our problem. When's it going to be? Betty, when you planning on dying? Haven't set the date yet? Well, that's our problem. See, that's all of it. I realize we can't set the date, but how many of us really realize and think about every day we're going to die and we are going to meet God? We need to realize that every day of our life. And when you really see the need, you don't have to be motivated to study. You don't have to be motivated to do what's right. You don't even have to treat your wife right, even if she's as mean as my wife. You can treat her nice. Why? You see, there is a need. See? There is a need. In other words, I have a need. I don't care what you do to me. I have a need. And that need is to be right with God at any cost. But we let that thing go. We forget it. We don't really realize we're in that danger. Last week I started out, you remember telling about hearing there that one out of every 3 people over 65 will fall this year. Being a good Jew, I was so proud of myself because I knew I would not be one of them. See? I actually thought that. I mean, it hit me. I was like that guy you remember over there, the publican at the wall. Thank you, Lord, that I'm not like this guy that falls. Turned around and just a little while went out and fell. See? Well, here's another problem. You remember last week I told you how great it was because now then I know better than anybody in here. I know I can fall. You remember me making that point? Now let me tell you tonight, I'm the worst guy in here. I'm worse than any of you. Because you know what's happened to me this week? I've gotten that cocky attitude back that I won't fall. I walk down the stairs at home. Every time I go down the stairs at home, I got it made, boy. I'm watching. I won't fall. See? And so now, who's the one that'll probably do the falling first again, see? And so this is just a little story, but it's like life. It's like life. What happens when let him that thinketh he standeth? What's the problem? You see? We've got that problem in there. Well, now, this was the Jewish problem. This was the Jewish problem. And we're all familiar with the Jews during the days of Jesus. What did they think of themselves? See? How powerful, how high, how protected were they? Because they had Abraham's blood, you see, running through their veins. Now, I'm spending time on this because I want us to understand we're not preaching to a building full of Jews here tonight that has that attitude. But Paul was preaching to Jews that had that attitude, see? He was preaching to the Jews that had it. So he had to dispel that disposition or that attitude. So that's what he's going about now in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is a sinful condition of the Gentiles. Chapter 2 is a sinful condition of the Jews. He's going to show the Jews, you are just like the Gentiles. There's no difference in you and the Gentiles. You're all in the same boat. So keep this in mind in chapter 2. This thing we got up here. It's chapter 2 doesn't show or talk about the wonderful salvation of Christ. It talks about man's horrible condition in sin because of our own actions. So chapter 2 is kind of a unique chapter that's in the Bible. Now what we learned so far is this. God says he will render to every man according to his works. He went on and he says those that are patient in good works and they seek for glory and honor, incorruption, eternal life, they're going to find it. On the other hand, those that are factious and obey not the truth and so forth, then what's waiting on them? Wrath, indignation, tribulation, and anguish. We talked about this last week. And so what he's trying to show them is that these are your two choices. And he says then it's to the Jew first and also to the Greek. He said there is no respect of persons with God. Now, respect of persons, that word, respect of persons, has the word face in it. And it means judging by the face. Judging by the face. Now, do we have, as human beings, normal human beings, do we have a weakness of judging people by the way they look, by how pretty they are, how handsome the guy is, how he's dressed, just the appearance? Any of you ever judge somebody like that? We do all the time, don't we? See? We do all the time. I read this last week, people saying somewhere, I forget now who it was wasn't a Christian, some heathen, and talking about judging people wearing clothes. And he said, I've noticed this. He said, I've noticed from the very bottom of the rung of the ladder to the very top of going into a bank to borrow millions of dollars, that it does depend on the clothing that you wear when you do that. That we're judged in here. Now, we get so that we expect kind of to be judged in that way. Now, God is saying, I don't judge you by your face. That's what that means. No respect to persons mean, I don't judge you the way you look. I don't care how handsome you are. I don't care how beautiful. I don't care how young. I don't care how old. I don't judge you by the way you look. And he said, I judge you on these bases of every man according to his works. Then he makes that unique statement, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, if God is no respecter of persons, why is he going to judge the Jew first and then the Greek? Why is it that the Jew seems to stand in the primary situation of really being judged by God? Okay, did they have a unique opportunity that the Gentiles didn't have? Were they given the law? Were they given a covenant and relationship with God? See? Were they given Moses to lead them through the wilderness? Were they given all these opportunities to see all of these things? Who really has the greater responsibility? The one that has all those opportunities, or a Gentile that was out there that didn't have them? See? So he said, I'm judging everybody according to their works. And he's going to talk about this. But he said, it's the Jew first and then the Greek. Because I gave the Jews the opportunity first, and then the Greeks are following along in there. So now, this is what we're getting ready then to talk about here tonight. So we start out now, as we're going to be down here, well, what about the law? So if you look down in verse 11, that's the verse, chapter 2, verse 11. For there is no respect of persons with God. Now we're going to start in verse 12. Now the question is going to be, what about the law? Now this is a question that Paul knows the Jews have in their mind. Well, if God doesn't think more of us than he does Gentiles, why not? Who did he give the law to? Aren't we the recipients of the law? You mean to tell me that God doesn't think more of me as a Jew after what he has given me than he thinks of those Gentiles that he hadn't given any of those things to? Now, the Jews were pretty proud people. What were the things they were proud about? What can you come up with that really, really proud, haughty? Abraham. They were Abraham's seed. They had Abraham's blood. What else? Okay, they were the chosen people. That fall in with Abraham. The law. Look who he gave the law to. It must be something special. There was one other thing that had to do with the covenant, the chosen people, but they kind of set it apart, held it up, big, gigantic, great, about 6 feet long. The word, what? Circumcision. Right. We've been circumcised, and the Gentiles haven't. So those are your 3 big things that the Jews were camping on, and that Jesus Christ and Paul here has to take away. So now, what about the law? Okay, that now is where we're going to start right here in verse 12. Look here what he says. For as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. Who would that be? Who is it that didn't have the law and they sinned without the law? The Gentiles. They weren't given the law, and so when they sinned, it wasn't because they were breaking the law, because they weren't under the law. See, the law of Moses. Then he said, and as many as have sinned under the law shall be judged by the law. Now, who's that mean? As many as have sinned under the law, who's that? The Jews. Now, you're going to be judged by the law. You know, we might scratch our head right here and ask ourselves this question. Which do you suppose, which group of people would have the greater strain or greater standard of judgment? The one that wasn't given a law, a written law, or the one that was given a detailed written law? Which one would you expect the most out of? See? The one that had that law, you see. Huh. Yeah. All right, then he goes ahead and he says, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Now, when you got the law, it's not just the hearers of the law. The fact that all of you Jews hear the law, you hear the law every Sabbath, but that has no effect on your judgment. It's not the hearers, it's the doers. So Paul is showing you're going to be judged by your works. And it's those that absolutely do the law. Now in verse 14, for when the Gentiles, now then he is going to start here talking about them. How do they sin? What do they do? For when the Gentiles that have not the law do by nature the things of the law, these, the Gentiles, not having the law, are a law unto themselves. Now, this is kind of interesting. Here it is, the Jews were given a written law. The Gentiles were not given the law of Moses. They weren't given the written law. By the way, was there any law in existence before God called Abraham, put him up on the mountain and gave him the 10 Commandments? Did God have any laws for mankind? Now, I'm not asking about written laws, I'm asking any laws. Now, if there is no law, the next chapter says there is no sin. You cannot go out tonight and break a law of Washington if that law is not in the law books of Washington. You can't break it. See. Uh, Next week, Washington may pass a ordinance that says all church buildings have to be closed by 8:15. Well, if they do, next week we're here at 8:30, we'll be breaking the law of Washington, wouldn't we? But suppose tonight we stay here till 10 o'clock. Would we be breaking the law of... No. If there is no law, you can't break it. You can't sin. Now, was there any sin before the law of Moses? Oh boy, there sure was. When did sin start? Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and went right on through in there. Now, this is God's oral law. God spoke to people orally. It's called a patriarchal law. That is, that God would speak to the patriarchs, and he would give them verbal instructions about what to do. And God had given mankind instruction about what to do. By the way, when did it become wrong to kill somebody? Was it when God gave Moses the law, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill? Is that when it became a sin to kill? No. When did it become a sin to kill? Well, when Cain did it, it was wrong. So way back there, you see, it was wrong. God had given mankind laws. So keep in mind, there are laws that are different from the law of Moses. When God gave Moses a law, we'll see what it's for here. He gave it to him for a particular reason. And we need to understand these things to understand really Paul's logic as he goes through here. So what I want to do right here, we're going to come back and we're going to pick this up right here. But I want to divert just a little bit, and I want us to ask a question here about the law of Moses. What's the purpose of it? When did it come into existence? See? What's the situation with it? Now, as you start out there in the purple, and you go down through, here it is, you're headed down through, and all of a sudden, God called what man and started the nation of the Hebrew nation? He called Abraham. See? He called Abraham, and he did that. Now stop to think before this happened. God had had Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They sinned. He expelled them out, and then all these people lived down until Noah's day. And what had happened to the world in Noah's day? Every thought and imagination of man's heart was evil continually. They'd sinned. So God cleansed the world with water. And then what happened after Noah's day down to the Tower of Babel? What had all the people done in chapter 11 of the Tower of Babel? They'd all got together to rebel against God. Now, before God called Abraham, this is the time when God had them to speak all these different languages, spread them out, and then he called Abraham. He said, I'm going to quit trying to work with all these people, and I'm just going to work with one nation. Now, before God called Abraham, was there such a thing as Jew and Gentile? No. There were just people. They're just people. But now when God called Abraham, God called him out, and he started a nation. I want you to zero in on that. He started a nation. That nation was called the Hebrew nation to begin with. Why was it called Hebrews? They just wandered around. And the word Hebrew means somebody that just walks around. So they were called Hebrews. Then, after Isaac and Jacob came along, then God's changed Jacob's name to Israel, and then this same group of people became known as Israelites. They became known as Israelites. Same group of people. So now then they're called Hebrews, and they're called Israelites by both of those names. And then finally, God gave them the law. He took these people, these Hebrews, these Israelites, and he gave them the law. He took them up on Mount Sinai, gave them the Ten Commandments, and then gave him the whole law then at that time. How many years was it after he had called Abraham they gave him the law? You remember? About 430 years. So it's a long period of time that's in here before that happened. Now then, I want to raise the question, what was the purpose of the law? Why was the law given? Now remember, as a Jew, here it is, I'm really cocky. Why is it that I am better than the Gentiles? What's one reason? The law. I was given the law. We Jews have the law. Okay, what was the purpose of the law? See, is that really what it's all about? Now, I want to look at these 4 scriptures, all in Galatians, because they'll all tell us something about the law. So flip over there to Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. And over here, Paul makes a statement about the law. And he says this. He talks about being justified by faith. And I want you to come down to the last phrase in that verse. Because by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Now let's just zero in on that. What was the purpose of the law? Well, let me tell you what was not the purpose. It wasn't to justify the Jews. The law was not to save the Jews. God didn't give them the law to save them. He didn't give them the law to justify them. A lot of times we forget that. Well, the next thing is, let's turn to Galatians 3 and verse 10. And here we learn another thing about this law. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who continueth not in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. Interesting. If you're under the law, you're under a curse. Now, who was under the law? The Jews. So what is he saying about the Jews? Said you're under the law, you're under a what? You're under a curse. Don't start bragging about that law. Don't start building yourself up and thinking you're saved because of that law. That law cannot save anybody. And you're under a curse in there because the law itself says, cursed is everybody that's under the law. And then he tells them why. He tells them why, and this is kind of a shocking thing, and that is the third thing, that it was, I shouldn't have given that right there, because it demanded perfection. So let's look at why it is. Why is it that you're under a curse? It says, cursed is everyone who continueth not in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. So what does a person have to do if you live under the law in order to keep from being cursed? You have to keep the law. How complete? Total. 100%. Well, why is it people were cursed then? Why didn't they keep the law 100%? Who's the only individual who ever did it? Jesus Christ. And so, now then, he gave them the law, and you say, boy, even the very next verse in here tells you, in here, I thought it did, but he do it in them is there, and goes ahead and tells you no flesh shall be justified by the law. So the law wasn't given to justify us. The law was given, and it was perfect. It was perfect. The law was. Remember Romans 8:12. You may want to write that down. The law is holy and righteous and good. So keep this in mind. When we talk about the law, there was nothing wrong with the law. Who gave the law to Moses? It was God. You think God gave him something that was wrong? No. The law is holy, it's righteous, and it's good. It tells you everything you need to know. But it wasn't given to save you, because you have to be perfect in order to be justified under the law. You have to be perfect, and the Jews weren't perfect that's in there. So then we say, well, what then is the law? Well, let's go down to verse 19, chapter 3, verse 19. And here we find an interesting thing again about the law. I want us to look back up at verse 18 to start with, as you look at this chart. For if the inheritance is of the law, it is no more a promise, but God promised it to Abraham by promise. There, or granted it to Abraham by promise. Now, what have we just found out about the law? Who's going to be justified by the law? Nobody. Now let's go back, and here we find he says, God did grant the inheritance by a promise. To whom did God give the promise? It was Abraham, wasn't it? He gave the promise to Abraham. He gave the promise to Abraham how many years before he gave the law? 430 years before he gave the law. And he promised to Abraham, through thy seed shall all nations be blessed. Meaning all nations, whatever nationality you are, you can be saved. But it's through the promise. Now the promise was in effect 430 years before the law ever came into effect. I have a question. If God gave Abraham the promise, and he said, Abraham, through your seed, which is Christ, shall all nations be blessed, did there need to be anything else come in order to save the people? Have to be anything else come in? If so, what was it? You say, well, the law. Was the law brought in to save people? No. Law wasn't brought in to save people. The law couldn't save anybody. Well, the question is then, why did God bring the law in? Why do we have the law? The law of Moses. That's verse 19. What then is the law? If all these things are true about it, why in the world do we have it? Now, here's your big thing. It was added. Added to what? Added to the promise. The promise he gave there. It was added to the promise because of transgressions. So it was added to the promise because of sins. That's the reason the law was put in. It wasn't to save you. Don't need the law to save you. What is it that's going to save us? Whether you're in the Old Testament or whether you're in the New, what it's going to save you? It's going to be Christ. Well, what then is the law? It was added because of sins. It was added because you people were so sinful. That's what he's saying. You Jews were so sinful that he added the law. Now let's look at it in this way. When teenager 16, he gets his driver's license. Dad and Mom gets him a car and sends him out on the road. He drives around. The kid never breaks the speed limit, never squeals his wheels, always very courteous in his driving, stops at every stop sign. Absolutely perfect. How many laws do the parents call him in and give to him? When do the parents call that kind of a teenager in and say, now I want you to sit down at the dinner table, son, and we're going to talk tonight, buddy. And I'm going to tell you about speeding. That ever happen? No. What do you and I know if we walk in on a parent? Let's suppose tomorrow night we go visit somebody. And here's Dad, he's a teenage boy sitting at the table. And we walk up and we hear Dad say, okay, now let me tell you something. 55 is the maximum. And you better not drive over 55 miles an hour. And when you come to a stop sign, I mean you come to a full stop. And you be in by 10 o'clock every night. So you and I back out because it's embarrassing. And we go home. They don't even know we heard him. What do you and I know about that teenager? Do we know anything about him? Yeah. That teenager has been breaking the law. That teenager has been a wild driver. How do we know that? Because Dad is giving him laws. When do you give people laws? When are laws given? By the government? Or by God? Or by parents? It's when people are not conducting themselves properly. Then you have to lay the law down. That's what we say. Now let's look at the Jews before Moses gave the law. God called Abraham and started out, and Abraham had Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, on down the line. What happened to the Jewish nation in those 430 years? Did they just keep getting better and better and better and better? Or were they disintegrating fast, 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 fast? And you look at the patriarchs, those wonderful, wonderful patriarchs. Those wonderful 12 sons of Jacob. Name me a good one and don't mention Joseph. Well, so you start looking in here, and you find sin involved in that nation. And now, Christ is not going to come for another 1,600 years. By the way, why didn't God just send Christ back there instead of Moses? Why didn't he just send Christ at that time? It wasn't the right time. And how do we know it wasn't the right time? What gives you such great wisdom? Galatians 4 says that Christ came at the exact right time. See? It tells us he came at the right time. So I'm not wise enough to know, but I do know it was not the right time, that people wouldn't have accepted him, wouldn't have appreciated him. So there's another 1,600 years in this world that this world and the Jews have to exist before Christ comes. Now, at the rate they are disintegrating and going downhill, where will they be in another 1,600 years? At the rate that this teenager is driving, in the first 6 months he's got his driver's license and 37 tickets. Where's it going to be if he's not held under control? See? Why, going to be dead. That's the way of the Jews. God gave the Jews the law to hold them under control. The law is to hold you under control. I'm giving you the law because you're sinners. Not because you're such great people. So don't get cocky about it. Now then, the last thing right here in Galatians 3:24, how long were they to have the law? He gave them the law there. And so we'll start in verse 24. So that the law is become our tutor to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So what was the law for? The law was for a tutor. That word tutor doesn't carry quite the same definition as in the Greek word here. We talk about a tutor today, and that's a teacher. This is more like a school bus driver. A master of some kind that holds the kids under control. Now, they didn't have school buses in those days, so the people, in order to assure that their kids got from home to school to where the teacher was, going to send everybody over to Aristotle or wherever it is, they would hire a man to escort these kids over. You come by every morning, walk my kid to school. You make sure that my kid gets to school and my kid gets home. That's what this guy is. That's this tutor it's talking about. Now, God gave the law as this tutor to hold them under control. By the way, as your little boy's going down the street, here it is, the tutor, he's walking down the street with him. The little boy picks up a rock and starts throwing it through the neighbor's window. What's that tutor have to say? Whoa, don't you do that, buddy. So the kid runs out in the middle of the street. Get out of there, get over here. What's the job of that tutor? It's to keep that kid safe, get him to school, get him back, get him to school, get him back until he got an education. What was the purpose of the law? To hold the Jews under control until Christ came and they could see that they're saved by faith. See? Now, there's where we're close tonight. But what we tried to do is set the tempo here to show here about these Jews, because a lot is going to be said about the law in the book of Romans. And so I wanted to take this time tonight to set the stage so we can see the very purpose of the law. The Jews didn't have any bragging rights because it was given to them. Okay, class dismissed.